flagged. And I think that's probably the way you have a unit or a particular course within another kind of an overall degree. So that would be my conclusion. At the same time, because it's so wide-ranging, I think there's plenty you can tell about and want to make it interesting. Now I'm going to talk about measurement, right? One of the problems you have in anti-Semitism anti-Semitic studies, is there are people out there who will challenge, right? Okay? It doesn't exist, you exaggerate, so what? Those kind of things. And I think for the whole question of measurement, I'm going to try and show you the different ways of measurement, and it's all about analysis. Can we analyze it? And this is, what I'm going to show you is empirical social science, right? And that in itself is being challenged by postmodernists and others, right? It's fake news, right? And therefore, it might not be the idea of, in the old days, of providing factual evidence, right? An evidence-based argument, evidence-based policy is under, what should we say, challenge, I guess is the word I keep using, by not only scholars, but by politicians, by people out there, who will say that there's, your prior assumptions are what creates the data you present. Anyway, let me just show you a few things, and I want to show you how one can change the data. There's a number of, I want to show you the interpretation, and then try and relate that back to what I've just spoken about. So these are some of the things. This is what I and a colleague did a report. It was a study of Jewish students, generally in the United States. Lots of questions about their economy and their attitudes and what they were studying. And we have 2 or 3 questions there on what we might call anti-Semitism. Right? Now this is a report that was done by the Pew Research Center, which is an independent research center in Washington. And this is where we began, looking why we asked about Jews. And it says experiences of discrimination by US Jews. Right? It's the percentage are reported in the past year they've been called offensive names by age. In other words, going down the street and someone called them something bad. How they knew they were Jewish, presumably some of them were wearing, at least Orthodox males would probably be, might be possible to identify them. But one of the things you notice here, right, and this is, I think, where we began, why we put these questions into the student survey was, there's what we call a linear progression, right? The older you are, the less likely you are to be called, to get an offensive name, right? To be called offensive. There's a quite thing. The younger the population, and these are the victims, right? We don't know who the perpetrators are at all, right? We don't know if this is an 85-year-old person that accused an 18-year-old who called him something nasty, right? We don't know anything about that. All we do is know that it was young people, right? 22%, just over 1 in 5 of the young Jews who were interviewed in a national survey in the United States said they'd been called an offensive name, right? For being Jewish, by the way. It was not just for them. Now we have questions here. These are the students themselves. This is 1,157 Jewish students on. We took the 50-something campuses across the United States, 50 universities. They were stratified by region, and you can see here that just over 50% of them said they had experienced anti-Semitism. So what I'm trying to point out here is we're not dealing with the anti-Semites, we're dealing with the Jews and their perception, right? Which is a whole different area, right? The victims. And we've got some idea of what we might call in what circumstances this happened. So they got it from an individual student, the largest number, right? There's some overlap, but most people had 1 or 2 incidents at most. In clubs and societies, were more likely to happen Did they have it in a lecture? Did they have it in student union from the administration? So what we see here is, as far as we can say, higher education as a system has a very low incidence of anti-Semitism, according to Jewish students, right? It's a societal problem, right? It's in clubs or from individuals. It's not a systemic problem, okay? So this is the difference to what I was talking about earlier in the 1930s, right? Or the 40s, where there was actual discrimination. The colleges had policies, keep out the Jews, control the Jews. They should sit here, sit there. That's not the system anymore. It's not the professors and the presidents of universities that are carrying out this, that are obviously the perpetrators. So we get, through the victims, we get some idea of the perpetrators and the system. Okay. That's very nice. So this is the report of those reporting anti-Semitism, right? So the United States is an equal opportunity society, right? Now the most interesting thing, to me at least, is more females were reporting anti-Semitism than males. Quite surprising, but it shows probably, you know, the reality of American colleges. And you can put it down to, you know, female student. Quite, you know, our typical assumption is that it's a male, anti-Semitism is a kind of male thing. It comes back to Goldhagen's executioners. Now look at the whole piece here by year, right? If you're a newcomer, we put them in different areas. If they were freshmen, juniors, sophomore, what it means, first, second, third, fourth year, or postgraduate. And there's no difference, right? It didn't make any difference what year you were in, which is interesting. What major you had, right? What you were studying doesn't make any difference. The type of location and the type of school, is a private school or a public school. The range is 44 to 70%, it's highest in the South. On the other hand, private schools in the South have low, public schools high, but the range is not as wide as you'd expect, right? I mean, the whole thing is very interesting that it's pretty flat across everywhere. People who said, I'm Jewish, I'm religious, I'm spiritual, I'm secular, we're trying to get some kind of background information there and saying, is it going to make any difference? Doesn't seem to be any difference amongst the Jewish students, whether they're religious or not religious. So, you know, what are the perpetrators trying to do? The synagogue denomination, this is even the most surprising thing, that the Orthodox had a lower incidence of anti-Semitism than the others, right? Reform Jews are the most assimilated, the least likely to be able to be identified. And they had the highest, they had much higher levels than the Orthodox. They didn't have a lot of Orthodox, right?
Perhaps the Orthodox are less sensitive to anti-Semitism.
It could be. I mean, again, you're right. I mean, it could be there in Europe. They have a lower pain threshold, or higher pain threshold. But it may be that they don't mix so much with non-Jews, so therefore they don't have the problem, right? If you're in a fraternity or sorority, Jewish one, you're more likely. People with Chabad, you see student involvement with Hillel, not much difference there, though, right? The type of organizations, again, reflecting the religious stuff. Political organizations, right? So the ones who were involved in AIPAC and more Israel-oriented had higher level, but even the J Street liberals had a problem, right? Half of them had something nice. And the most peculiar thing, we said, are you open to non-Jews about being Jewish on your campus, right? And there's no difference. Even the people who try to hide it had problems. Most peculiar. All right, so what comes out of this is that there's a kind of, it's not serious, but there's a kind of overall level, right? That seems to permeate the society, right? And it's not the usual, these are not the usual suspects that we can round up as victims anyway. So this was asked in the UK in 2011, and we repeated the question, US in 2014. Now this is, again, is very surprising. There's no difference really statistically between the United States and Britain, right? On anti-Semitism rates. They're both reporting roughly the same amount. Personally subject to anti-Semitism in the past year, and it's It's no worse or no better. I mean, again, it's peculiar. But the statistics are good. I mean, from a statistical analysis point of view, the fact that it's flat across most places suggests that we haven't got a lot of anomalies. We haven't just sort of identified hotspots. Right? But again, you know, is it that, again, the friend here said that, you know, certain types of Jews just ignore this, or other types of Jews are very sensitive to this kind of thing. All right, so look at the difference between the UK and the United States. Okay, so this is where we begin to get some differences between the two societies. Right? Now you notice in the US, there's a much higher level of individual interaction, right? You can interpret that in different ways. That the British are more polite and less likely to insult people face to face. It's a more inhibited society, or the other one. The other thing is that the student unions and other contexts are stronger in Britain, and that's because it's a much more politicized campuses, you know, here, and a much higher proportion of Charles would say, higher proportion of Muslim students in Britain than there would be on these campuses in the United States. So that may be one of the reasons. But again, what do we notice here? There's hardly any difference between the administrative systems. So the Jews don't feel as though the system itself is picking on this. In these other contexts, it's much more personal, interpersonal anti-Semitism. So this is a different kind of anti-Semitism to what we're talking about 100 years ago, 60, 70 years ago. All right, now there's another. That's the finished American students. Now I want to show you something else that we did. This is done for the JDC, and I've done a number of surveys for the Jewish leaders.
Did the survey, the previous survey, contain any specifics about the nature of anti-Semitism?
No, it's self-certified, if you want to call it that. That was the whole point. We wanted this. We didn't actually say, you know, this is anti-Semitism, right?
Was there an open-ended question that what kind of anti-Semitism did you encounter?
No. It was just first of all, we didn't expect to have the results we got. And it was just put in there just for this comparison with Britain to see what it was. But it wasn't a major study of anti-Semitism, right? Nor was this one of European leaders. These are just, when you do a long survey, you have much more, you know, more important things to talk about or to investigate. Israel and anti-Semitism. This is East Europe versus West Europe. This is 28, I think, European countries. And these are the differences between what it showed was that Western Europeans generally felt more worried about Israel than Eastern Europeans. They were more likely to feel ashamed of Israel. The hostility of the media was regarded much more seriously than the West and the Eastern Europeans. And the Eastern Europeans really means the old Warsaw Pact countries, not East Germany. But Eastern Germany has now gone to the West. The media in my country portrays Israel in a bad light, much higher in the West than the East. You see that? Events in Israel sometimes lead to an increase in anti-Semitism, right? Much more likely in the West than the East of Europe. And again, that's the demographic makeup of these countries, right? There's many more people who feel maybe pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab or Muslim in the West and the East. Okay, just to give you an idea of who are we talking about? Because when you talk about anti-Semitism, who are the people who are making these decisions? You can see these are the Jewish leaders, by the way, right? So that gives you an idea of who Jewish leaders are in Europe. There's a few in each country. I think there's 6 or 10. Most of the countries, more from France and Britain and Germany. But you can see that the Jews are generally, Jewish leadership is not as monochromatic as you might think. a minute. So, this is, of course, coming back to Charles's point, has it got worse, right? Most people are pessimistic about things. You ask them about things, you know, are you better off than you were 5 years ago? Most people tend to see the past as more golden than the present. Individual, human, psychological people. The further things that are in the past, the less problematic they are, or dangerous. But what you see here is, they were asked, this is the Jewish leaders, about anti-Semitism and the sources of anti-Semitism. And what you see here is this note here of the internet, right? And we all know that social media and the internet is creating problems for everybody in all areas now, right? And in every case, they claim that the expressions of anti-Semitism have increased in the last 5 years. This is the Jewish leaders in all parts of Europe. But you notice that it's in the area of what we might call communication that it's up, right? And in the areas of what we might call practicality or actual manifestations, physical manifestations, it has increased that much, right? So the dead Jews are not, you know, are not doing as badly as the live Jews with the internet, right? Okay, the desecration of cemeteries hasn't increased that much. Vandalism of Jewish buildings is not that, hasn't increased that much. It's much more the media and politics. Less in politics, actually. Okay, and it was much, and overall it was much more likely to happen. The Westerners were more worried than these. Right, we asked Jewish leaders who their allies were. So there's another way of looking at it. Who are the people who you think you can rely on to help you, who are not going to be bystanders, are not going to be anti-Semites? That's a good thing. Who are the Philo-Semites? They thought actually there were fewer people, more pessimistic. They saw their strongest allies would be the national government, right? So most of them thought their national governments, coming back to that students, that the legal bodies, if you want to call that, the institutions are not anti-Semitic, right? So the current governments, in fact, current governments do better than Jewish organizations abroad as far as they're concerned. They're more likely to rely on their national governments than in the past. Part of that is, of course, reflects the European concern with terrorism and increased security operations, right? There are more police on the street, there are more guys walking along with machine guns that Charles complained about, and the Jews feel much more confident that there are more people protecting them, or protecting society in general. Now, the point is that if you look at the government, people in government are regarded as allies, but when you go down to the actual political parties, they saw them as less supportive. Political parties, of course, make up the government. But it seems that once political parties had the responsibility of law and order, they became less more allied with the Jews, which is interesting. Centrist political parties were seen as the most reliable, right? Middle of the road, not left, not right. I think we were talking about France yesterday. Macron yesterday, President Macron, the new president of France, yesterday dealt with the Drancy, whatever it was, deportations, and he admitted for the first, not the first time, but actually rebuked Le Pen and said, yeah, Vichy was part of France, it was the French establishment, we can't get away from that. And he also said that anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism. So I think that would be classic example of this kind of middle of the road, the liberal parties, not left, not too right. Now, Christian leadership are much more reliable than human rights groups, according to Jewish leaders, which is interesting. They haven't got a great lot of confidence in civil rights groups. International human rights organizations, poor allies, intellectuals and academics. I didn't put the ones they saw as enemies, but academics and intellectuals are not regarded as great allies of the Jewish community the mainstream media as well. So again, intellectuals, the media, words, communications, that's where the Jews feel under pressure, and at the same time they're feeling that those people are not very supportive. But they don't believe that I would suggest there, they don't have many dependable and firm allies in European society. Those scores are not very high. Okay, now we look at who are the threats according to the Jewish leaders. 40% said right-wing nationalist parties always, most of the time, which has gone down a little bit. Marxist left-wing parties, interestingly enough, not seen as much as Israel's right-wing. Muslim religious leadership, not regarded as high as you might see. This is kind of, might not fit with some of your preconceptions. But mainly, again, because Eastern Europe doesn't have a lot of Muslim religious leadership. As you saw, the West saw right-wing and Marxist parties as more dangerous, which is interesting. Non-mainstream media, the West was more worried about Muslim religious leaders. The Easterners saw conservative and Christian parties more as a danger than Westerners. So this, if you know European histories, some of it's counterintuitive and some of it's exactly what you'd expect. Older generation felt the leftist parties and Muslims were more dangerous than the younger generation. So that's, again, the victims. Younger leadership was less worried than the older leadership. But now we come along to perceptions. And this is psychologically the most, shall we call it, the weakest part. People's expectations, people's fears are never good indicators, right? They tell you about their individual psychology, whether they're, if it's a group of pessimists, then, everything's going to be bad in the future. But most of them thought the situation was deteriorating in Europe. They expected the problems to increase. They tended to be pessimistic. They thought prejudice against Jews would increase. Only a very small minority said it would decrease. Right? Again, you have this whole feeling of that things are getting worse. And even more interesting is the fact that the Westerners were more pessimistic than the Easterners. And again, it comes back to the general turnaround as orthodox. Some Jews, again, experience more anti-Semitism. So, and we'll see that when we come on to the individual countries. That, they expect it. So, it's always been around. It's no worse than it was 20 years ago. If you've never experienced prejudice before, then it's quite shocking, traumatic for you to suddenly have a crisis that you face. All right, Israel and anti-Semitism. No differences towards Israel by age or gender. Largest differences, if you want to know what the Jews saw Israel, if you see Israel as counteracting anti-Semitism or support for Israel being a classic. Why you put these kind of questions in, because the essence or the origins of Zionism were Zionism was to protect the Jews. National sovereignty would be good for the Jews and would protect them from anti-Semitism. It's Herzl's view that anti-Semitism would always be in Europe. And the only way to solve the problem is for the Jews to leave and set up their own country. So that you'd have a Jewish policeman to protect you rather than a non-Jewish policeman that you had to persuade to protect you. Hostility in Israel, again, related lower by people from Eastern Europe. Differences there are quite significant between West and East. And again, this whole question about anti-Semitism being caused by Israel is much more than the West. All right, now let me look at a colleague of mine, Lars Denchik, who's actually Swedish, but he's at university in Denmark. Goes across the bridge every day, I guess. And he says there's this is important. Can you distinguish different types of anti-Semitism, right? Are there a number of different strains in anti-Semitism? I've already spoke about economic anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, social anti-Semitism, right? Psychological, religious prejudice, anti-Judaism. You know, and this I think is he uses two surveys, and anybody who wants the FRA survey, I think it's going to be repeated this year or next year, isn't it, or something? This is done by the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights out of Vienna. And it looks at 8 European states. Some of you see your home team there. And the other one is a ADL survey of representative samples, just carried out in 102 countries, looking for people who don't like Jews. And the samples are not directly comparable, but you'll see that even though the samples from if you were going to predict elections or something highly, which need very precise data, you might not use this. If you look at this, the data is very robust because it tends to be confirmatory of certain things. All right, this is, now, you've got two things here, right? Now this is where we come back, is what do the Jews think about anti-Semitism as victims? And how many perpetrators of anti-Semitism are there in the population? In other words, Jewish perceptions of anti-Semitism, people's anti-Semites, right? The balance between the two. You put them together here, all right? The 80s, so you've got the percentage of the population harboring anti-Semitic stereotypes compared with the proportion of the Jews locally in their country who think anti-Semitism was a problem, right? So there should be a high correlation. Lots of anti-Semites, the Jews should feel there's a problem, right? Doesn't quite work that way, as you see. ADL, proportion of the population. So now we're dealing with collective psychology, social psychology. In Hungary, 41% of the population have anti-Semitic stereotypes. It's the highest in Europe, right? Only 4% in Sweden of the population subscribe to the same anti-Semitic stereotypes. The difference is that is anti-Semitism a problem in Hungary? 89% of the Jews say yes. But also, 60% of the Jews of Sweden say it's a problem, even though 4% of the population are anti-Semitic, right? So there's a total imbalance, right? So you can see it. The Hungarian Jews probably are correct, right? And the Swedish Jews sound paranoid, okay? I mean, that's the, you know, they sound, right? We'll go into why they might say this. But, you know, there's no correlation. You see that? Look at the way it goes up and down. 28% of the Latvians say there's ADL, but only 44% think there's a problem, right? The lowest is Latvia, right? The Jews in Latvia, you know, are the ones who are kind of closest to reality, right? And the others. So again, it's counterintuitive. Now, what do you do with this kind of data when it's counterintuitive? Do you say it's all nonsense, or do you try to explain it? Right? You know, what is the validity of the data? You know, look at the difference between Belgium and Germany. The Belgians think it's more of the Jews in Belgium, with quarter of the population, they both agree. Latvia, Belgium and Germany all say that the same proportion of the population is anti-Semitic, right? But there's great variation there. The Belgians, again, like the Swedes, seem to be a bit more concerned. The Latvians, much less. France, look at that, you know, 37% of the population in France. Now, the interesting thing is the difference between France, we're going to go on and see the difference between France and UK. The numbers in France versus UK are in terms of anti-Semitic stereotypes, are very interesting. But it may be because you've got different types of anti-Semitism being combined there, right? But again, okay.
Can I make a point?
Yeah.
But there's a big difference in the way of the methodology.
Yes,
The ADL has a
Yeah.
problematic
Yes.
measuring system. They measure reported incidents,
yes,
usually from police forces and some police forces, and the way that they collect data is spotty from country to country. The
no,
FRA
this is asking,
yeah.
asking the Jews.
No, the ADL records incidents. The FRA is asking.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So there's a big
Yeah,
difference in
yeah,
methodology.
yeah, FRA is asking. Right, the proportion of the population harboring anti-Semitic stereotypes divided by the, so you see, you know, what the relationship is, and you can see Sweden is an outlier, even if the data is pretty.
I'm sorry to interrupt, could you just explain what you just said?
So the ADL collects data from community sources, from police sources, and the level of, or the standards of recording incidences differ from country to country, and the methodology is problematic. It's not coherent or scientific.
So this isn't opinions of people?
No, this is the ADL recording instance. Then the FRA, which vary.
The population one,
Then
the Jews.
The FRA is going to, it sends out questionnaires to members of the Jewish communities of these countries and asks their perceptions of anti-Semitism. So the methodology are very different.
Yeah, I mean, then you're looking at, you've got apples and pears here, but there should be some ratio, right? Some relationship between the two. This is what I'm really trying to point out. I think the ADL one actually does, it's not about incidents. But, well, no, it's not incidents. I'll show you the one about incidents later. No, the ADL one is not a, the problem with ADL is the representativeness of the national samples and the questions, which are inappropriate. But you see that anti-Semitism as a problem is perceived by these communities more than the reality of the population in this study, right? All right, now, this is the FRA. This is the one that he and I might agree with is more reliable. So where is this, now we're back, away from the Jews. Is this the Jewish answers, right, of Jewish identification of perpetrators. You understand? So you're asking the victims who the perpetrator is, right? Someone knocks you on the head and you say, it was an old lady, but I think she's a member of the Communist Party, right? Okay, that's the thing. That's what we've got here, right? We're identifying them ideologically, right? You have no idea who the actual person is. We've got an ideological vision, right? That the categorization is it's a political classification of the perpetrators. It doesn't say they're young men, it doesn't say they're old women, it doesn't, could be, you know, somebody's dog, I guess. But this is, so look at the difference between the countries. Now, the greens are the people who you'd expect in green. It's all very nicely color-coded for us. Is the Muslims, right? Who are 56% of the perpetrators in Belgium, 51% of them, 53% in France, 51% in Sweden, and in Hungary, completely different pattern. You see that? In Latvia, they didn't actually find out anybody. But you see that the Hungarian perpetrators are completely different profile politically to some of the Western Europeans, which explains those answers I got from the leaders, the distinction between Western and Eastern European Jewish leaders. That's to their problems, right? Someone with left-wing views seems to be more of a problem in Italy. In Italy, there seem to be more left and right political views, more indigenous, than Muslims, right? It's interesting in Italy. There seem to be both Marxist, communists and fascists, or whatever it is. Traditions are more strong. In Hungary, it's the right wing, the conservatives. Germany reflects a little bit of Italy. Sweden, however, is interestingly enough, is Muslims and leftists. UK is a little bit like the Swedish one at the lower level. So what we see here is this whole question that there is different types of anti-Semitism. It's coming from, in different places, it comes from different quarters, different sources. Yeah.
If you would have this survey in the US,
I have no idea what would happen, but the Muslims will be much lower because they're a much smaller fraction of the population. Okay, this is the questions about what they did, the FRA did, was measure aspects of anti-Semitism in the population. So classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. The Jews are too, they're rich and religious prejudices, Israel-related accusations, that kind of anti-Zionism, and then what they called Enlightenment-based attacks on Jews. Enlightenment is kind of the Voltaire idea, mainly about Jewish practices, circumcision, they call, unfortunately, ritual sort of kashrut, kosher slaughter, shechita, the slaughtering of animals, like halal for Muslims. And what you see here is that classic anti-Semitic stereotypes, which were in Hungary, remember, was right-wing, and right-wing anti-Semitism was the problem, and therefore they got classic, right? So Hungary is in the 1930s still, and some of these, Sweden seems to be in the 21st century, right? Completely different. Enlightenment attacks are stronger in Germany and Sweden on the Jews. There's more what we might call anti-Judaism. I guess the Enlightenment-based attacks are really anti-Judaism. And that's stronger in Germany and Sweden than it is in UK and Italy. Is not much difference. A little bit more in this. In France, you've got Israel and Enlightenment. So the patterns are very different, how they're made up. But the right-wing anti-Semitism is low in the UK and Sweden. And how would we explain that? Well, think about it. Those are the two countries which either weren't occupied by Germany in World War II or were fought against. All the other countries there are involved with, well, actually all occupied by the Nazis, weren't they? Okay? Every one of those, the 5 to the left. 6 to the left, were all Nazi occupied in World War II, or allies of the Nazis. So, that's why you would expect right-wing, classic anti-Semitic stereotypes to be right a little bit higher. Israel-related is interesting. It bears out what the leader says. Look at how low it is in Latvia and Hungary. Israel is not their problem. Right? It's not the one that's creating anti-Semitism. Okay, so we've got explanations for these things in some way. Right? We can look at those. Right, now this is an ADL US poll, right? And what I'm looking at here, again, I'm looking at 3 types of Muslims, right? It's a poll of Muslims and their stereotypes. Stereotypes that this is a Muslim respondent replying to questions about Jews, right? So again, we may have a slight bias in any Muslims who actually answer these questions, right? Why would they answer? They're being asked in English, so there's probably not a lot of recent immigrants involved. There's a whole lot of, again, it's not just the sampling there, but the likelihood of it being a good cross-section of Muslims. But that doesn't matter. What we're interested, at least the person who set this up, was to looking at 3 types of Muslim populations. Muslims in the US, Muslims who are resident in Europe, and MEN, Middle Eastern and North African Muslims. Muslims in Muslim countries. Okay? So, what do we see here? We see that the blue line, which is Muslims in the US, I don't know if I'll go down a little bit actually. See if I can get more in there. Oh my God, Ira?
Yeah. I'll work on it.
I just wonder if I could lift it up or something. I don't think, it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't
Doesn't, But what you see quite clearly is that the prejudices against Jews amongst Muslims vary by geography, and they're in a pretty clear pattern, right? Okay? That the US Muslims seem to be, I don't know if you would regard it as this as being low levels of prejudice, but it's certainly lower levels of prejudice by area. The more westernized, the further west the Muslims go, the less radical they get, or less anti-Semitic. Right? But what is interesting is the one that counters that, the anomaly there, right, is about, you can see that, the one about the Holocaust. Okay? The Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. Okay? Muslims in the Middle East probably never heard about the Holocaust very much, or they, it doesn't bother them. So Muslims the Holocaust is not the issue for Middle Eastern Muslims that it is for European Muslims and even American Muslims. So that's the only one that doesn't follow this, what we might call geographical linear stratification. But look at the highest. The Jews have too much power and financial markets, right? I mean, some of these are leading questions. I mean, they kind of, Jews have too much power in the business world. It's a very similar question. So there's a kind of validity to you get the same answer twice. Too much control over the media. Much less. Jews have too much control over the United States government. But Jews think they are better than other people. Okay? Chosen people stuff seems to be less problematic to Muslims, right? Global affairs. Jews, they take the last one, the one you can see. Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. Highest goes in an expected direction. But what is interesting, I think, as much as anything else, is that although the three geographical units, the gaps between them are quite static or consistent, they all fall at roughly the same rate, right? You can see that the patterns of anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitic prejudices, right? The strength of them is near enough to declines or increases amongst all three groups of Muslims. Anyway, I don't know if that makes, this is more than there's more anti-Semitism or less anti-Semitism amongst Muslims than you expect, but it just, it shows you that, again, anti-Semitism doesn't come in one package. All right. This is about Holocaust denial. I took this one especially. It's a good one. This is the number of people in these various populations that actually have heard of the Holocaust, right? So the one in parentheses in the block at the bottom is 96% of the American population have heard about the Holocaust. 84% of the US Muslims have, 72% of European Muslims have, and only 38% of Middle Eastern Muslims have heard about it. It's one of the reasons why they didn't think they'd heard, the Jews made too much of a fuss about it. And again, the blue lines are the kind of liberal, positive, acceptable response. The Holocaust happened, and the number of Jews who died has been fairly described by history, right? So this is, sort of what the Jewish communities and historians would expect. 91% of Americans believe that. Only 1% of Americans in the population, the US overall, are Holocaust deniers, right? Which is probably surprisingly low. But it's also interesting that amongst US Muslims, the Holocaust denial is very, very low. In fact, it's low everywhere except the Middle Easterners who haven't heard very much about it are more likely to say it's a myth, which is interesting. The Holocaust happened, but the number of Jews who died is greatly again, you interpret this the way you like. Does it surprise you? Ignorance. So now we talk about education. Does ignorance and lack of knowledge produce prejudice or not? In the US, at least, it seems that the population has heard about the Holocaust and actually believes the historical record. The fewer the people who've heard about it, the more people you've got either saying it's exaggerated or never happened. Have I got anything else here? Oh, wait a minute. All right. So I've dealt with public opinion. All right? Now, I'm going back here now to criminal justice system. Right? The criminal justice system. This is the rates of incidents of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, this country, for 4-year period, well, a 5-year period, yes. And this is reporting by Jews, the victims, to the authorities. Like we heard last night, this whole question which came up about, do you trust the authorities? Is there a recording of it? Right? Again, looking now at what do the Jews do when they have a problem? Okay? If they have harassment, and anybody, I used to teach crime statistics, criminology one time, one of our courses, and all crime is underreported, right? All crime is underreported, except certain types of crime. There's a kind of paradox to this, right? You get higher crime rates where the police force is efficient. Understand what I'm saying now? Right? The more trusted and the more efficient the police force, the higher the crime rate. Okay? So, I'll give you the classic. I used to give it when I was at the City University Graduate School, a PhD program in sociology. What is the most crime-ridden city in the United States? Right? No. It is Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon has the highest rates, not of interpersonal violence, but of most other forms of crime. Right? Property crime especially. Maybe I should say property crime. Why is Portland, Oregon has the highest crime rate? Because it's the last place in the United States where people will report the theft of a bicycle. Right? And think that the police will actually find it for them. Right? So you have much higher crime rate. Right? Report it to the police, then the police catch the person who stole the bicycle, and so there's much more crime than there is in New Haven. Right? It's obvious. Right? Now, so with criminal statistics, right, and back to anti-Semitism, how do we look at these things? Does the Jewish population feel vulnerable? Do they feel that the system operates for them? We saw this in France, right? Not only did the people didn't report to the police, they didn't cooperate. Last night in the movie, okay? They didn't. So only 6% of Jews who were harassed in the UK in that period reported to the police. 7% reported to another organisation, which was the Jewish organisation, and then some reported to the police and another organisation. But as you can see there, something like 71% of Jews in the UK didn't report to anybody that they were harassed, and for anti-Semitic purposes. Now, the proportion of people who had physical violence against them, which they regarded as anti-Semitically inspired, again, less than half reported it to anybody. Right? Now we come to vandalism. Right? Vandalism is usually reported by the victim is more than one person. Right? It's usually an institution or home where people are there. So there's more than one person making the decision. Okay? So you get higher numbers of people. It's the only one where the majority of vandalism, probably against a synagogue or a cemetery, was actually reported to somebody. All right? So this is the criminal justice system in the UK. Okay. Now again, this is who the perpetrators were in the difference between harassment and physical violence. So Jewish perceptions in the UK, of, and this is taken from the security CST people that you're going to go and visit on Monday. People, someone with these, if you look at the physical violence, it's highest for Muslim extremists, and then somebody with another view. And then teenagers, a group of teenagers, kind of generic teenagers. And if you look at harassment, someone else. It could be, you know, it seems to be, harassment seems to be, again, much more generic. They're less likely to again, Jews are less likely to classify them themselves. Harassment, school of college. Now look at the difference between right-wing political views and left-wing political views. Right? The Jews in the UK think they have more of a problem with lefties than they do with righties, right? And more of a problem they slightly with Christian extremists. Make of it what you will, if that tells you about the prejudices of the Jewish community, that they see themselves as conservative, and therefore they find enemies around. Again, the interpretation could be, you could explain it away in many ways. But again, this is the data that organizations which are combating anti-Semitism have to deal with, right? Very, very murky. The Americans call jello. Getting your hands around it. Very difficult to come out with definite opinions about some of these things. Differences between Britain and France, okay? These are the Jewish communities in Britain and France, the CST and the, whatever it is, SBCF in France. And these are the differences in the number of anti-Semitic incidents for these different years, right? And again, there's this bit of counterintuitive data here. It goes up in, you know, slight rise. I mean, 2014 is a bad year. In 2004, you've got twice as many incidents nearly in France as you've got in Britain, but by 2009 the British have overtaken them, and in 2014. All right? Now that's not the impression you get about the situation for insécurité in France or what the situation is in Britain for terrorism or anti-Semitism. But again, we're back to reports, right? Is it the fact that even though only 50% or less than 50% of the British Jews report, is it that 80% of the French Jews don't report, right? That the French Jews have lower reporting, so they have a lower crime rate. Okay? So that's, the incidents are fewer in France than they are, but there seems to be some kind of, they usually go up and down together. Why 2004? The French Jews, was it that the French Jews reported more in 2004 and then lost confidence in the French system, political or criminal justice system, and then began to not report? Okay? So you could interpret this as a politician in many ways. Some of it is due to wars in the Middle East, as you can see. And then you have to think back of who the perpetrators were, right? The French ones said there were many more Muslims doing it, but left and right in France. So if you put all this together, it becomes very complicated. And my point is that you see and what I'm trying to show you is, when you're dealing here, we're not dealing with something which is clear cut, and therefore it's open to interpretation and also open to challenge by people for political reasons. You said French police were anti-Semitic or didn't care last night. They could turn around and use this to say, yeah, we do care. Right? Look how low the proportions are. So they could make their argument. Politicians, criminal justice, academics, analysts can play with it. And you know, and I haven't done anything, you know the famous book, How to Lie with Statistics. This is not, I haven't tried to lie with these, I just presented them. But the idea that empirical facts are totally persuasive right, goes out. Now, I don't want to be a postmodernist and say that, this means nothing, but at the same time, you have to be aware that it's highly nuanced, and the best you're going to get is shades of grey. You're not going to get black and white out of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. So we have about 30 minutes, 30 minutes for Q&A, discussion, comments.
Thank you so much for this fascinating question. I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is regarding your second or third slide about the percentage of Jewish students reporting anti-Semitism. And this slide about organization affiliation, when we saw that APAC affiliated Jewish students versus J Street affiliated. Okay, so my question is, whether you also checked students who were affiliated with JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not, maybe you would consider checking them as well.
Okay, well, they weren't on the list. We actually didn't think of including them in. The point about, I mean, again, you have limited number of questions you can ask. I don't think that Jewish Voices for Peace would be a very large proportion of the Jewish student population. I'm sure they're very vocal, but I don't think you would have enough out of the 15 or whatever, 1,200 students that we had to make it statistically valid, right?
So
I can't really answer the question. But what's surprising was that if you think about it, the APAC people are definitely out there challenging the opposition. And so they're more vocal and they go to meetings, and so they're more likely to meet hostility. What was surprising is that the J Street people had the average, right? They were no more below average or average. So there's two ways. Again, the interpretation is, how do they see their Jewishness and their Jewish identity? And are they more I don't know, vulnerable? Do they see themselves as more vulnerable? Have they got, what is their level of pain threshold, right?
actually, I don't know about that, because in the last few years, J Street on campus has been more mainstream than ever, and JVP became the new J Street. This is what I'm asking,
yeah.
they became the most radical Jewish voice,
Yeah.
let's say, and they opposed to the existence of the Jewish state in
Yes,
Israel.
yeah,
And this is why I'm asking that, actually.
Well, it may be that the J Street people were told that one of the things that came out why Jewish women were getting a lot of interpersonal stuff was, and I don't want to be saying anything against females, but they claimed that it was the Jap, the Jewish American princess, and they were being criticized for being too much bling. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, they were wearing jewelry, or people said, "Oh, all you Jews have got nice shoes or something, or wear too many expensive clothes or something." I mean, that was the kind of level at which, and why the women were reporting higher levels of interpersonal harassment incidents than Jewish men.
That's interesting, thank you. And the second question.
Yes.
You referred to this different kind of anti-Semitism than in the 20th century. What exactly do you mean?
Well, systemic institutional anti-Semitism was not evident there, right? It's not governments, it's not the university administrators, right? It's societal, right? It's social prejudices, like I'm talking about gaps. It's physical violence, like we saw last night, of the losers, right? So last night we saw the losers attacking the Jews. Paris 75 years ago will be the gendarmerie, right? Under Vichy. So there's a difference, right?
Interpersonal.
Yeah, it's much more interpersonal, I think. So it's not the systematic. There's no country in Europe, probably very few countries in the world, that have an official political, legal policy of anti-Semitism, right? In the 1930s, lots of countries had political parties and had definite policies to discriminate against the Jews
So when you're talking about anti-Semitism in the 20th century, you refer only
Early
to
20th
this,
century.
only to the, okay.
Early
Up
20th
till
century.
the
That's okay. And you again, and you're coming from the Soviet Union, and you know, I pointed out that you can have institutional anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union is an interesting case. The Russian Soviet Federal Republic was the first one to pass, to make anti-Semitism illegal in 1922 or whatever it was.
Yes, but the quotas thing, which you mentioned it, the
Yes.
thing about quotas in the universities.
Yes.
It then expanded to all of the universities, especially to law faculties
Yes.
and medicine.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like, you know, the President de Graan, you know, we don't have, you know, there are no homosexuals, so therefore we don't have any, you know, homosexuality, you know. So the Soviet thing, we don't, you know, we declared the fact that anti-Semitism is gone. So what we do is not really anti-Semitic, it must be some other policy.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to say, if people nod to me, I'll keep a list of people who like to ask questions. Okay? So I got a few people on the list already. I want to challenge you very briefly about systemic anti-Semitism. So if we look at the processes of globalization and neoliberalism, and the fact that Western countries, the United States, Western Europe, are supporting major corporations like Boeing, like Siemens and others, to do trade, to bring in the Founding Nations, Iran, a regime that calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people, the State of Israel. If there's military agreements with this, if universities are being funded in this sort of free market liberal system, it's different than it was 60, 70 years ago. But is there not a systemic element of contemporary anti-Semitism that we're facing now?
Well, I mean, what I mean by systemic, I think, is the classic thing of legal, institutional, in other words, nobody. Now, it may be that you can't get a job at the University of Exeter's Department of Middle Eastern Studies, right? But it's not the University of Exeter doesn't turn around and say that we don't employ Jews, right? And that's the difference between systemic and yeah. So no. Think about it. We have race relations law. It's illegal in nearly all of these countries to discriminate on the basis of religion and race and all this. We got European courts of human rights and all this. It's very, very different. Now, what people do in practice, of course, is very different. So what you're talking about is social reality versus it. But it's not legally bound through acts of legislature.
But it is.
But there's still disparate impact. I mean,
Yes,
it's like
disparate,
from
of
back,
course,
like,
of
it has
course.
this effect.
But human
right?
beings will game any system.
So when you mentioned the different styles of collecting data,
Yeah.
because the ADL has used these same patterns of questions for over a decade
Yes.
now, you said it was unacceptable.
I didn't say it's unacceptable. No,
So what-
he was the one. Yeah.
No, that's not acceptable. There's just different methodologies.
No, it's very difficult. I mean, some of these countries, I mean, I see things, I've done studies of religion, right? And show that they're more atheists in Saudi Arabia than, I don't know, some other countries. It doesn't sound to be right. I don't know where they found the people, I don't know who replied, I don't know what the European Leaders Survey, right? We did it in 5 languages, English, French, German, Spanish, Hungarian, okay? So if you were in Greece or Poland, you had to make a choice on what language, which wasn't your native language, to answer the questions, okay? So that's already clouds the piece. Did you understand it properly? You know, I mean, you've got all these kinds of things. The ADL has got to find national samples for people. The asking in dictatorships or hostile environments questions is very difficult. You know, people don't. I mean, again, I do public opinion in the United States, and we found new immigrants to the United States, especially from Eastern Europe, Middle Eastern, third world countries, and all this thing, are much more reluctant to answer questions, and if they're political, religious, or any other questions, refuse the question, right? Because it's dangerous where they came from to answer, right? You're a fool to tell anybody these kind of things. It will be used against you by somebody, right? So the best thing is to be stumm, silent, whatever you want to call it. So obviously, it's very different, right, between different countries, the way the questions are asked and the rest of it. But doing it consistently, right, you can compare, you've got apples and pears, but if you have consistently bad apples, you can decide which ones are getting worse, right? So if you do the same thing several times, you may get a trend line, even if we're exaggerating, right? But it's going up, it may be, the trend will tell us something, but not the actual rate that we're getting, right? So that would be my argument for actually being proactive and doing these things.
Prof, I wanna get your point of view about some opinion. I got from the survey that people in Middle East, Middle East, North African children, have a high percentage of anti-Semitism in different way. So I know besides the religious factors they have, maybe that's the point I was thinking about it. So because they all the time believe in the theory of conspiracy. Do you agree with me?
Conspiracy.
Yeah, they all the time claim that all the disasters, all the problems they have came from both Israeli and Jewish Zionists around the world planning to make them down and this is that. But when it's they make this point as to make a justification to their behavior against Jewish people and then anti-Semitism.
Well, let me just say, societies that are authoritarian, I mean, you know, going back to the classic studies of authoritarian personalities, authoritarian personalities accept the leadership and of charismatic leaders. They're also more likely to believe in conspiracies, right? That's, well, you know, people who are fundamentalists believe this is truth and the rest of it is lies and a conspiracy. They have a very, very binary view of the world. So you get, I imagine if there's a rise of fundamentalism in Islam, right, you're going to get more people believing in conspiracies. It's a kind of package of psychological characteristics that go together as a bunch. So I think that, you know, I'm not surprised. If you go back again to we started, you know, what is the Protocols of the Elder of Zion? It's a conspiracy theory, right? It was very popular in Europe, in certain societies, in the 20s and 30s, and it was associated with extremist political views, right? Extremist politics, especially right-wing politics, is adopted conspiracy theories, right? Then are the famous physicist, was a supporter of Chamberlain, right? And Chamberlain's one is about conspiracy. The Jews and the British trying to destroy Germany. That was classic. You know, it's a mindset which is I wouldn't surprise, which is not surprising. And societies, I think, one of the things we have to look at is the collective psychology of societies changes over time, according to the socioeconomic and educational circumstances. Yeah, I mean, you know, all the other data shows that people from Muslim countries at the moment are more likely to believe in conspiracies than other people. But we come back to it, the politicians, right, as in the interwar years in Europe, the politicians specialize in conspiracy theories, right? So they encourage it because it explains their problems away.
Thank you.
So, if we go, I know that Charles challenged that and there may be questions about it, but if we go to this idea that there's less systematic anti-Semitism, but more societal anti-Semitism, that would seem to imply that the anti-Semites control the media and the banks. The Jewish community, right? I mean, what that says? That says that anti-Semites control communication. They don't control government, they don't control, right? They don't control the systemic rules, but they do control the social communication system.
Well, according to European leaders, they control the internet, right? You saw that, you know, that was...
The anti-Semites control the internet.
Yeah. There was more of it on the internet than the university.
Yeah,
and also the universities. And Charles believes that it's global capitalists.
Right,
Right?
no, that's
what he says. They're the ones who are the anti-Semites.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
not about the Jews that we own, the media and the banks. We're saying the
Well, not
anti-Semites
the
own the
banks.
banks.
He believes it's
No,
the company.
but that's very important. But I think what we have to study, this is very important. is not to do descriptive analysis only, to do quantitative and qualitative. And we have to understand the processes, economic, social, and cultural, and political processes associated with globalization. So the role of structural adjustment, the role of capital plays a role. I'm not blaming the capitalists.
Yeah.
I think as scholars, we have to understand the processes.
But let's go back to what
But
did
the media
affect,
seems
what
incontrovertible
affect,
that the media
before we
has
had,
changed.
before the 1970s, we had the Arab boycott, right? It was run by the Arab League, and many Western companies agreed to adopt the Arab boycott. And they did two things. They didn't open anything in Israel, Coca-Cola, whatever it was, wouldn't operate in Israel, or operated under a different name, or as and at the same time, they wouldn't employ Jews, because they didn't want to upset the Arabs. And it was well known that in the United States, oil companies in Texas didn't employ Jews, right? Because of the links between Exxon and Aramco, Saudi Arabia. So, undoubtedly there's been, but again, today, that probably it would be much more difficult for oil companies in Texas to discriminate against Jewish applicants any more than, well, they kept out blacks and whoever they wanted to. Just African Americans weren't acceptable to the Saudi Arabians, so they also, oil companies in Texas never employed them. It was just, they were willing to accept the cultural terms of countries. Now that's changed. Think about it. Most countries, let me give you an example of that global thing. In most third world countries, bribery is the way you get business done. Right? But today, companies in the United States and many Western countries cannot bribe foreign officials, right? Otherwise, they come under a U.S. federal law, and even the officers who do this are liable to criminal penalties. Now, so that's changing the system, right? They've passed legislation to stop corruption in American companies, and that had a little bit of effect on the third world. Yeah, it probably doesn't help much. Probably Nigeria still operates the way it always has. But it means Americans don't operate in Nigeria exactly the way the other people do. So that's the difference between,
Barry, I'm just raising my,
I knew I was promoting.
So a very dear friend, a good friend,
Yeah.
I feel a need to say one or two things. I know you're saying this in jest.
Yeah.
And I am not one to defend the entire third world in any way, shape, or form. But I do caution very, very seriously that we need to be careful about terms that are not nuanced and subtle. I reject completely the idea that in third world countries, how you do business is through corruption. I think questions are way more complex than that. So I just want to mention that.
I apologize for that. I didn't mean. I should have said in terms with state corporations.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
I know you very well as a very dear friend, and I know you don't intend it that way. But nonetheless, as we do interact with good and dear friends, sometimes we have to do these things in public. So I feel a need to register that observation. I agree with you, however, that neo-patrimonial systems are prevalent in many global south countries. Certainly in the country where I was born and raised, Nigeria being a glaring example. But I think those questions, as you rightly know, are structural and systemic. They do have more to do with the profound challenges of the modern nation state itself as post-colonial entities. So I just want us to be aware of these kinds of questions. I feel a need to say that and just to say very briefly. Thanks very much for allowing me to.
No, I accept that. I wasn't saying the whole place is corrupt. But certain big deals there. South Africa there was a big issue about the purchase of arms, for instance, from different European countries and payoffs and things like that. But of course we got also accepted that there's a corruption scandal in Israel now about submarines, if I remember rightly. So it's not. What I was pointing out was There are many countries that don't operate. But if you have, and I was trying to point out, if you have legal systems in place, right, which prevent in one of the partners, right, criminal sanctions, that will have an effect on the other countries. I was actually trying to say that it actually was lessening that problem. But that's how systems operate. So exactly the same way as about discrimination. You're correct. People will game the system and it will not be enforcement, right? But there's no doubt that the adoption of legal penalties and systems, it does help. Otherwise, we would have no change at all, right?
Something you said earlier caught my attention, because it reminded me of some of my research here years ago when I was looking at Britain and the United States and issues of race and policy making. There's a great book called When Jim Crow Met John Bull. And it's fascinating because it talks about the U.S. experience in the UK, soldiers in the UK during World War II. And there was a very interesting kind of dialogue that occurred. We had black, then Negro soldiers here in the UK, and in support of the war effort, and you had them from, as you can imagine, North and South, right, during the segregated U.S. period, our own period of apartheid, or their own period of apartheid. I won't own it, but that nonetheless there were really interesting tensions which occurred, where we had white Southern soldiers being furious at bartenders and pubs for allowing the blacks from the South to come in, and now they had this public space which they had to share with their fellow black soldiers, and the troops had been segregated and their lives had been segregated, but now you had this black guy at the bar asserting his right to have a drink. And he was a fellow soldier, but they wanted the policies, the segregationist policies, enforced here, and fortunately they were not. But it was just interesting to see that it's very similar to the dynamics we were talking about before, where you have individuals bringing their own prejudices, their own policies, and attempting as if to graft them, as it were, onto other territories and spaces.
I just want to quickly add a perspective that as much as, I respect what you said, that perhaps it has to be subjective and nuanced about, all third world countries, but many countries, including the country that I come from here, India, it's a non-formal society, and I agree with you that half of the laws are there, which is perfect, they are not implemented. And it's a non-formal society, bribery does go a long way. And I would also say where the government fails, the private sector industries deliberate rights sometimes. Just an observation. So actually I kind of support the idea of what you said, that perhaps, not true for every context, but it's true for many.
I would add all contexts.
I'm just being balanced here, but bribery goes a long way.
Yeah, I suppose the point I'm making is, and I don't want to belabor this issue, quite frankly, it's not necessary to push this argument to its limit. I guess because of the purpose of a gathering like this, and I may sound rather preachy, in part because we are teachers after all, we are learners after all, we need to be very, the question is not to be defensive in any way, shape, or form. The question really is to take very seriously the kinds of analytical interventions that we need before we draw conclusions. That is the point. That systems matter, historicity matter, structures matter, and the kinds of realities that give a particular outcome. That's the only point I'm suggesting. I understand the very nature of post-colonial society and post-coloniality, and I think that's really what we need to engage. So we can move beyond individual behavior and get into very serious structural and systemic analysis. If we teach, our teaching ought to be structured on the kinds of research and analytical tools we adopt to teach, so that we're not teaching just based on observation. I mean, I raise this question in light of the fact, and this isn't, we will always teach diverse communities, right? We will always teach diverse cultural, social, racial, ethnic communities in a globalized world. That is very much our audience. And as we engage these kinds of subjects, we need to be mindful of those kinds of questions. I mean, if I teach this subject in the elite liberal arts college that I teach, I know, quite frankly, there are students in my classroom who will feel offended by such intervention and who will take me to task. It may very well be a footnote, a minor footnote. But these questions are not minor anymore in a transnational world where the local, the national, the global are really in our classroom. And I think curricular questions inevitably need to engage these kinds of thinking. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not suggesting in any way that Barry's observation is in any way off point. I think the observation is in fact correct. It's empirically correct. But it's more important to seriously engage the kinds of thinking that will make empirical observations better received, that will resonate better as we think about our pedagogy.
I mean, I have to add this, that when you think about, you know, in Southern cultures largely, and I do not mean to, you know, be offensive to anyone, you know, censorship with education is a big thing. And in, certainly, I can say in India and in various other South Asian countries, genocide education, Holocaust education, anti-Semitism is a far cry. It's not taught for various reasons internal, you know, because when you've got to be accountable not just for one historical context, but the others too. So there are various complicit, concentric complicit dynamics that takes place with censorship, which is a, you know, in public education where the curriculum development and review is extremely flawed. So just making that observation because we're just on that subject.
Anybody else for a final comment, question? Okay, so thank you everybody for your interventions. Barry, thank you very much for your lecture.